Hello, my name is Clinton Askew. I'm a Director of Citywide Financial Partners and a member of the Financial Conduct Authority's Smaller Business Practitioner panel. We're here today to provide you with an overview of the RDR Disclosure requirements. And with me today to discuss this is Rory Percival from the Financial Conduct Authority. Hello, Rory.
Good morning.
The RDR introduced specific disclosure requirements for services and charges on advisors and firms. I wonder if you could just tell me what that's meant.
One of the main objectives of the RDR was to increase transparency about the cost of advice. And so we've got a number of requirements in place that sets out how advisors should do this. Broadly, there are two stages involved. The first stage is the generic disclosure about the nature of the charges and the services that the firm offer to clients, so that the client can understand what they're going to get and what they're going to pay when they go to see that firm. The second stage is what I refer to as the specific disclosure. So that typically happens after the client has met the firm and the firm now know what services they're going to provide to that client. So it's specifically, this is what it's going to charge you, cost you individually.
So specifically then, what should firms be doing?
Okay, the first stage is to think about the scope of service, which is our expression for whether firms are independent or restricted. Now, firms need to say that they are providing restricted advice or that they are providing independent advice. And they need to use those terms, independent or restricted. If they are restricted, then in addition they need to explain the nature of their restriction.
Isn't the term restricted challenging? I'm thinking here because it covers such a wide range of business models. For example, we might have a single advisor working with a single product provider. Alternatively, we may have an advisor working with a whole of market almost, except for one product range. What's the situation with that?
Absolutely, yes. The restricted category is very wide, but that's why it then becomes very important for firms to explain the nature of their restriction very clearly.
So, can restricted firms say that they offer advice from the whole of market?
It depends on the context. What we don't want to see is firms introducing a new label called whole of market. We've got independent and we've got restricted. Those are the labels and they shouldn't add to that. However, it could be that that is what they're doing in relation to a particular product area. So for example, if a firm just deals with pensions, they could say something along the lines of, we are restricted because we advise on pensions only and not any other investments in the market. However, across the pensions market, we review and advise on products of the whole of the market, and that would be fine.
That's independent and restricted, but what about the actual services that firms provide?
One of the things they need to bear in mind is that advisors need to explain in their disclosure material what services they provide, not only on an initial basis, but also what their ongoing services are. And just in relation to ongoing services, one of the areas that we have had concerns with firms is that there's not enough detail about what that ongoing service involves, particularly about what the annual review entails. Sometimes firms will just say, we provide an annual review. However, one firm's annual review could be very different from another firm's annual review, and we've seen that in practice. So firms do need to give a bit more detail about what's in that review. Some firms it might be just, we review your existing investments. Other firms it might be, we also review possible rebalancing and also perhaps fund switches and other services. So you need to be clear about what that annual review actually entails.
Okay, and what about advisor charges? What's expected here?
It's the two-stage process I mentioned earlier. So the first stage is the generic disclosure, and this is typically in firms' initial disclosure documents. So this would be things like the terms of business or a client agreement or the services and cost disclosure document. The format is entirely optional. It's up to firms how they disclose the initial charges. However, there are a number of requirements about the nature of that disclosure. It needs to be in cash terms, for example, if your basis of charging is a percentage basis. Also, if you're working on an hourly basis, then you need to ensure that you give an indication of how many hours is likely for each service that you offer.
And what are the expectations around this specific disclosure, as you call it?
Okay, this typically happens after the fact-finding stage. The advisor now understands what services they're going to be providing to that client, what work is involved, and hence what the cost is. So it's at that stage you would expect the advisor to disclose specifically and individually to that client, this is how much it's going to cost you. And this needs to be in pounds and pence, rather than a repetition of the generic charging structure.
Is it okay to disclose the total advisor charges in either the suitability report or the illustration?
It depends on the circumstances. If the suitability report or illustration come quite shortly after the fact-finding stage, then that can be okay. However, you have to bear in mind that that might be a much later stage, in which case that wouldn't really meet the requirement as soon as practicable. We really expect firms to explain to clients what the cost is going to be, where they know that, and that's often after the fact-finding stage. The other thing to bear in mind about if you're doing it in the suitability report or illustration is that it depends on how your charges work. If the client has incurred costs by that stage, then that's potentially a problem, because if they decide not to take up the recommendation, what happens then? The other thing to bear in mind is if you are preparing a key features illustration and you are facilitating the advisor charge through the product, that does need to be shown in the illustration.
So what happens if the advisor doesn't know exactly what the fee is going to be? I'm thinking here about firms where the fee is a percentage based on assets under management, and that's not known at the outset.
Okay, I can see a couple of examples where that might apply. The first one would be if it's a replacement business. Clearly the amount of the investment is not known until that replacement business has gone through. Similarly, if the advice is to recommend, say, buying 1,000 units in ABC fund, then that again is not going to be known until that transaction has gone through. In which case, as soon as practicable means shortly after having undertaken that transaction, where you know what the cost is going to be. However, the firm is going to know the percentage and know approximately what those amounts are going to be. So we would encourage firms to give an estimate in advance.
So Rory, is there anything else that we should know about charge disclosure?
There are a number of other requirements in the rule book that firms need to be aware of. We've covered the main points here, but do make sure you're covering all the different requirements.
Okay. And what should firms do to ensure that they're compliant with this?
Well, firstly, looking at the rules themselves, they're not particularly long and they are quite specific, and they can be found in COB 6. The other thing that we've done to make it easier for firms is produce a fact sheet, which is a 2-page summary of what the rules require. So that can be used as a checklist to ensure that firms are compliant. We've also produced a thematic report last year that provided lots of good and poor practice, and we also undertook some consumer research in that area.
Thanks, Rory. We've covered quite a lot here. I wonder if you could just summarise the main points for us.
Sure. First thing around services, be clear about whether you're independent or whether you're restricted, and use those terms. Also, if you're a restricted advisor, explain the nature of the restriction. When it comes to charges disclosure, remember that there's the 2 stages. The first stage is the generic disclosure. This is what your charging structure is. If you are using a percentage basis, then you need to explain what that means in cash terms by using some examples. If you are using an hourly rate basis, then you need to give an indication of what each service is going to entail so that the customer can understand, in broad terms, what the cost is going to be for them. The second stage is the specific charges, which is it's now going to cost you X pounds and pence to provide you with this service. But I think in the final analysis, it's take a step back and look at your disclosure material from the client's perspective. Are your clients likely to understand exactly what you're going to be charging them and the services that you're going to be provided? Is it in terms that they can understand? Is it in terms that they can engage with?
Thank you, Rory, for those answers. And thank you for watching. We hope that you found this video on RDR Disclosure helpful and informative.